So the a7 IV came out pretty recently, but the a7 III was and still is a fantastic camera. In fact, I'm using it right now to film this video, and most of the videos on this channel are actually shot on my Sony a7 III. Now, I use this camera for all of this sort of stuff, but also client work, photo, video, whatever it might be. It's a really capable camera no matter what you want to get, but absolutely, it did come out, what, 3 and a bit years ago now, 3.5 years? So it is showing a little bit of its age in terms of certain kinds of features, but that's where the a7 IV came in, and that was a really substantial upgrade in lots and lots of different ways, and both are fantastic hybrid cameras. So let's talk about both of them, let's compare them a little bit, and let's talk about what you're gonna get from each camera and which one might be right for you. So let's start off with photography. Now, the a7 III has a 24.2 megapixel sensor. It's actually really good for things like low light, and you get good detail in your shots. It's not as high resolution as a lot of cameras are these days, but it definitely gets the job done, and there is room there to crop a little bit as well. Now, for most stuff that I shoot in terms of client work, that's more than enough for printing big, I've had big banners and billboards and stuff like that printed up. 24.2 megapixels absolutely covers that. But the a7 IV has 33 megapixels, even better low light performance, and it's a little bit better with details in darker areas of the image. It's slightly less muddy. Now, all of that is just great news, right? You're getting better quality images, more megapixels to play with as well, which generally means you've got more room to crop, which means you have a little bit more room to play around with the final image. Now, I really like that in my photography. I really like shooting a little bit wider, maybe getting a variety of different shots, and being able to crop adds in, I'd say, an extra dimension into your editing that you can use, which is always very, very handy. Those extra details in the darker areas, slightly better low light performance, all that kind of stuff is also very, very useful for certain kinds of shoots. You're looking at 10 frames a second continuous shooting for both models, so there's no real advantage to either one in terms of actual speed, but the a7 IV has the advantage of taking CF Express cards, which means that the buffer is basically ridiculous. Now, I've never really had too much of a problem with the a7 III buffer, but I have had a couple of instances where I would have liked it not to judder a little bit. It'll do a little sort of slow down, which the a7 IV does not do. And of course, having a bigger buffer just means you are basically guaranteed to get whichever moment you're trying to get. Having a big buffer just eliminates one area of concern when shooting continuously like that. I mean, we're talking the difference between 182 JPEGs with the a7 III as a buffer, and then 828 JPEG and RAW with the a7 IV. So it really is a pretty substantial difference. Now, in terms of autofocus, the a7 III was very good when it launched, and it only got better through firmware updates as well. So we had things like Animal IAF added in through firmware, and that was a big, big deal. Taking pictures of pets, dogs, cats, whatever it might be. That was a really handy thing to have available in the camera. But the a7 IV has all of that at launch, and then more as well. So things like Bird Eye AF, which is fantastic, especially for wildlife photographers, bird photographers. It also has real-time tracking, which is great in photo and video. And we just see a general improvement in the autofocus speed and just performance as a whole. Now, we've seen this gradually since the a7 III launch, in the a7R4, the a7S III, and other smaller cameras as well. We've seen this autofocus just get better and better. And in the a7 IV, we see a really, really fantastic system. I mean, it really feels industry leading. And going back to my a7 III, from the a7 IV, it was very noticeable, the speed of the autofocus. The a7 III is no slouch at all. But the a7 IV is just very, very, very fast. It also has more focus points as well, which just works well for being able to track exactly what you want to track and capture exactly the right thing. When I've tried out the a7 IV, I never really missed a shot because of autofocus. It never really messed up. And that's not to say that the a7 III does, but it is a noticeable difference with the a7 IV. Now, something that matters for photo and for video is the image stabilization. Now, with the a7 III, it's 5 stops. With the a7 IV, it's 5.5 stops. I would say there is a noticeable difference with the a7 IV. You do notice, especially if you're doing handheld video, that the image stabilization does work a little bit better. But it's not enough for me personally to, if that was the only thing, it's fine. The a7 III is absolutely fine. The image stabilization in the a7 III is definitely good enough to do handheld video. I do it pretty much all the time. It's just a little bit nicer in the a7 IV. Now, video is obviously a big part of these cameras as well, because these are definitely hybrid systems. And this is where there's a big upgrade with the a7 IV as well. Now, of course, both cameras can shoot in 4K and they can shoot full HD as well. But with the a7 III, you are always locked in at 8-bit 420. And that's no longer the case with the A7 IV. You can shoot 10-bit 422, which is a really quite substantial upgrade over the A7 III, especially if you're looking to do professional videography or cinematography. You can also pair it with some of the cine cameras. That works really, really well. Whereas the A7 III, absolutely, yes, I do actually do video work with the A7 III for clients, and it's, for the most part, absolutely fine. But having that kind of slightly more professional spec is just such a big deal, such a good thing for the A7 IV. Of course, on top of that, with the A7 III, you can shoot 4K up to 30 frames a second, whereas with the A7 IV, that's 4K up to 60 frames a second, albeit with a bit of a crop, but it still means you can get slow motion in 4K, which is a big, big deal, because nowadays that absolutely feels like more of a requirement to be able to get some 4K high quality footage like that and be able to use a bit of slow motion as well. Of course, both cameras can shoot full HD 120 frames a second, which is great for that super smooth slow motion, but having the ability to do a little bit of 4K slow motion with the A7 IV might fit better into more of a modern workflow now. Now, they both have S-Log3, but the A7 IV has Cinetone as well, which is going to match better with things like the FX6, the FX9, stuff like that. And in terms of image stabilization here with video, the A7 IV has another advantage, which is an active mode that you can turn on to get slightly smoother footage. So in terms of video, if you're looking to do professional videography, or you have clients with specific needs or requirements, absolutely the A7 IV is going to be a better choice. The A7 III will get the job done, absolutely, and it has for me a lot, including right now. But the A7 IV offers you a bit more versatility, a bit more utility, and just in terms of those specs, if you're doing kind of professional videography, freelance, or working as part of a team, those specs might be key to being on that job versus not. But what about the feel of the camera, the design, the way it works? Well, obviously they both feel reasonably similar. The A7 IV does have some advantages, I'd say. So for example, it has the slightly raised buttons we saw on the A7R IV, which just feel a little bit better. They're a bit more tactile. We've got the new switch for switching between photography, video, and then S&Q mode, which actually, once you start using it, is really, really useful. And it's a great way of kind of separating which modes you're using. I mentioned before that the A7 IV takes CF Express Type A cards as well as SD, whereas of course the A7 III is just SD cards. But otherwise, the A7 IV does feel a little bit nicer, with the grip being improved. It's a bit more comfortable. That's not to say the A7 III isn't lovely to hold and use, but the A7 IV does just feel that touch bit nicer. But for me, the biggest difference between the two cameras here is the LCD screen. The A7 III has a tilting screen. Now, it is a touchscreen, but you can't use the touch menus, you can't use any of that. It's just touching to focus really, and you can turn on touch to actually take a photo as well. It's a 2.36 million dot LCD screen, so it looks kind of fine without being anything special. The A7 IV has upgraded that, so the biggest difference is it's a vari-angle screen. Now, this can be a little bit divisive. Personally, I love vari-angle screens. I think they make a lot of things a lot easier. For example, portrait mode, I like being able to flip the screen out and seeing it kind of down below, whereas with the A7 III, because it's a tilt screen, it only tilts out. So if I'm holding the camera lower, I'm gonna have to physically get lower to see the screen, whereas the A7 IV, I don't have to do that. But it's also a touchscreen in terms of touch operation for the menus, touch for focus, obviously, and touch shutter, all that kind of stuff, but it's a little bit more kind of a better utility of the touchscreen. It's also a higher resolution, 3.68 million dot, which does look better. It feels brighter as well. I don't know if it actually is, but it feels brighter. That could be that it's a little bit sharper, a little bit better resolution, so it just overall looks a lot better. Otherwise, the A7 IV has a faster USB connection. It's got HDMI Type A versus HDMI Type D on the A7 III. But one area that is interesting is in terms of battery life, the A7 III is rated at 710 shots, with the A7 IV is rated at 610 shots. So you're looking at a slightly better battery life on the A7 III. Now, I use my A7 III all the time, and I can tell you I've definitely taken more shots than that, a lot more shots than that on one battery, without even kind of getting close to it running out. So I'd imagine that's the same on the A7 IV. But either way, it's nice to know that the battery life is decent, really decent on the A7 III as well. Now, how do you decide between these two models? Well, obviously, and you would expect this and you'd hope this, the A7 IV is a better camera. Whether it's photo, whether it's video, it is a better camera, absolutely. If you're a photographer, I think the A7 III is absolutely a totally fine camera. I think you can get some really nice images. I love using my A7 III for all kinds of stuff. I use it for all genres of photography. I never have an issue. The autofocus is amazing. The continuous shooting is enough for the kind of stuff I do. Admittedly, if you are a wildlife photographer or a sports photographer, it might not be enough. But otherwise, I think you can get some great shots. Now, absolutely, do I think you're going to get more detail and more utility out of a higher megapixel count, better detail in the shadows, better ISO performance? It is going to be better autofocus on the A7 IV as well. Absolutely. It's going to be a better experience. You're going to have better end results, but you're not going to go wrong with the A7 III. Now, in terms of video, it just sort of depends on what kind of thing you're shooting. The A7 III can be a perfectly good camera for video. You can get some really nice stuff. I think that I'm able to get some nice stuff both in terms of shooting these videos and in client work as well. I can get some nice shots. But if I was doing a bigger production, if I was doing something a little bit more, intense with a team and various things, and maybe I wasn't the only camera shooter, it would be nice to have those better specifications. 10 bits is a big deal, 422, the ability to shoot 4K 60 frames a second would be fantastic in my workflow, both for kind of smaller clients and then for bigger productions. So while the A7 III can absolutely handle a lot of things, eventually you're probably going to have to upgrade if you want to do some serious professional videography, just because the specs don't necessarily allow it on the A7 III. But a big consideration here is going to be price. The A7 III is obviously a lower priced model now because it's the older model, and that depends on what you really want from your camera. You're definitely not going to go wrong with either of these. And like I say, if you're less about the video, then the A7 III is a great camera. Obviously the A7 IV, it's difficult. It's better in almost every single way, to be honest. But you're not going to go wrong with the A7 III. It doesn't make the A7 III a bad camera at all. And I still love mine. Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to know which camera you would be interested in getting down in the comments, whether you're interested in the A7 III, the A7 IV, or of course something else as well. Let me know down in the comments. Of course, there's links to both cameras in the description, so you can go check out the A7 III, the A7 IV, all the pricing, all the good times, everything over there, full spec. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, because there's new videos every day through to the Christmas Eve, the 24th of December. Until then, of course, well, I'll see you tomorrow. And as always, thanks for watching.